So, Rachel, I'm really appreciative and also admiring of your willingness to talk about this issue and to share not just your experiences, but all the insights that you've gained around this topic from the work that you've done later as an ally, as an advocate, as an activist in this area. And I think you're welcome to wear any of those different hats that feels comfortable at any moment as we're speaking.
Thank you. Thanks. Really happy to be here. And thank you for articulating the hats. Happy to hop around through hats.
I thought maybe we could start by just expressing what your aspirations are for speaking out about this topic.
Sure, sure. It is something that I think a lot of us come to unintentionally. That's the case for me. As someone who is a victim survivor in this area, in this topic, it is sort of had the role of being supportive of my healing, is trying to find purpose and meaning in what happened. And then it's also making sense of what happened to me and understanding it in greater context has been really helpful. And then that bridged into what is it like to support other people have that same healing and same process around what's happened to them.
Thank you. I think the frame for this whole conversation that we're having and for the series of conversations that we've been sharing with our community has been to support people who have gone through this experience, and also to alert Buddhist communities that there are things that we need to look out for, that sometimes our naive enthusiasm can make us fail to see things that we really need to be very careful around, with the hope of being able to prevent this in the future to whatever degree possible. And I know from speaking with you at other moments that that's something that you also care deeply about.
Yes, in my professional career, I work in public health, mostly community-based, and it's pretty astounding. It's universal that any type of community wants to find ways to fortify their safety net. And in the process of life, you'll find gaps and holes in that safety net to fill in. And then people come together to figure out ways creatively or innovatively, or even pulling from the past to do that work. So it's interesting that it's not in any way unique to Buddhism, and I get the pleasure of supporting that in a more public health traditional sense in my work. But it's fun to see it happen in religious communities. People pull together to identify and plan and move forward with ways to make things healthier and safer, and not to have shame or stigma around that process, since it's everyone, every community. In some cases, I'm sure I don't have this expertise, but you could deduce it down to even families, finding ways to make families safer and healthier, workplaces. I can't think of a single social setting where this doesn't come up, probably. Yeah, it's like it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So your own experience, it happened in a Buddhist community which you had joined, thinking that you had arrived at a safe place. Could you talk about what the ways that you were made to feel secure and the ways that ended up leading to your vulnerability?
Sure. I think some of it is just, well, for me, part of it was youth. The assumption that most people are safe is something that I, had going into my young adulthood. And then from there, thinking that religious communities were inherently safe was another assumption that I held, that a religious community would be the least likely place for there to be gaps in health and safety and protection for others, which I've had to learn since then is not the case for a variety of reasons. So going into a Buddhist community as a young adult, I was motivated to learn about the religion, I was curious to know more about it. And I didn't have a sense, coming from my background, I didn't know very much about Buddhism in general. And so I was pretty open to learning anything I could about it. But I think one thing that's interesting is it never occurred to me that I would learn anything that wasn't just, absolutely positive about the way Buddhism functions and functions in America. So I think that's still somewhat true. If you say to someone, this is something that happens to me when I say I'm a former Buddhist, no one anticipates the word former to be before the word Buddhist. So it's kind of a question mark of, wait, former, why? Who would be a former Buddhist? So I went into it with those things in mind. And then to say it's a very beautiful religion with very beautiful practices. So it's very exciting to grow and become a Buddhist. And the people that I was practicing Buddhism with, the Sangha that I was a part of, was full of really wonderful, beautiful people. So I was in this environment of where trust was pretty easy to have. And I was set up to be a person that was trusting. And so it really was just the marriage of those two things is how I ended up in a position of of being vulnerable. The word you used was vulnerable to finding myself in an abusive situation.
Could you say a little bit about any Buddhist concepts or practices that formed part of that betrayal of your trust?
Oh, that's a great question. I think my mind first gravitates towards the positive, all the things that were more like sticky, that like brought me in because they're so wonderful, like Buddha nature. That just so spoke to me. It's like, of course, yes, we all have Buddha nature. It's just beautiful. I think once I got to a place where I really accepted all of those teachings and practices, and they became so foundational in the way I thought about the world and thought about myself, it was just this perfect, like slick foundation, like very fortified place to put in, like sandwich in things that weren't positive. They could kind of sneak in because I could justify them with the positive things about the religion that I loved. The negative, and negative maybe is too strong a word because it's contextual, but the aspects of guru devotion are where things, in my personal experience and the experience of what I've heard from other people, started to get maybe not as healthy, safe, or protective.
Can you talk about how the idea of guru devotion was communicated to you, either by the teacher or also by the community initially, and how that ended up being a condition that led things to go so wrong?
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting too, because I've only learned Buddhism in the one community that I was a part of. So the complete picture is not something I have. Reaching into like outside teachers as sources of information in the community I was a part of was not promoted. It was really, there was adherence to a structure, to the lineage, to the teacher that you've devoted to learn from. So there may be gaps in my knowledge and understanding of how it exists outside of the one teacher I had that can be filled in by someone like you that has that knowledge and experience. But for me, it was really learning that it was an aspiration to see the guru as an enlightened being for the purpose of your practice, of your study and progressing in your practice. And that transitioned from it's an aspiration to see the teacher as an enlightened being to as you progress, the teacher is an enlightened being and your pure perception is to see the teacher that way, which kind of put in itself this autocorrect, like a spell check of anytime anything negative or not as safe or positive happened with the teacher, in my mind, I was autocorrecting it to positive because it was what my practice hinged on, was being able to see all the things the teacher did as beneficial to the benefit of all beings, right? So it really became, it was a slippery slope. Once you start auto-correcting your thoughts, that really can take you any number of places. I mean, it's where finally I found language around what it's like to be in like a higher control community. It's more that it's a higher control of your mind. You're just auditing your gut instincts and your thoughts and consciousness constantly, or more constantly than you had before. So for me, it was just a ramping up of that. And in doing that, I just continuously lost more and more sight of what was real, what was true, what actually was healthy and safe. And so it took me to places that ended up being very much so not healthy or safe. Yeah.
This idea that you're auto-correcting your mind or editing your mind is really so on target. And it also sounds very much like what happens when someone is being groomed for abuse, where the intuition tells you that something is wrong, right? And you have this other part of your brain that's saying, ignore that intuition, ignore what you feel, think of it this way, know it's okay, it's okay for the limits to be transgressed. Do you see that as part of a process of grooming on the part of either the teacher, or was it just a condition that happened to be there that got used by the teacher?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it's probably open for debate. I think that the way a young woman, I was particularly young in my late teens, early 20s, the way a young woman is set up to experience grooming behaviors compared to other people in a spiritual community is likely to be somewhat different. In the community I was a part of, some of the things that I immediately think of when I hear grooming behaviors are like things that are justified as in service to a teacher, like a back massage or a foot massage. Doing things that are physical are some of the things I've heard from other people, like how those can become exploited when you're given these tasks to provide service to a teacher. But for me, it was more just a mental trusting, a very much like a psychological trusting of anything the teacher instructed me to do, I was going to do it. And I think that was true for a lot of people, but I just got instructed into doing things that were more inappropriate than appropriate. It could be something beneficial at times, like the guidance to exercise or the guidance to eat mindfully, different things that we can all agree are harmless or relatively harmless. But there isn't an auditing process that I'm aware of for being able to have a boundary in your mind of when am I going to know that this guidance or this instruction isn't appropriate for me to follow, and I should push back on this instruction. That guidance and that culture just didn't exist where I was practicing.
Would you feel comfortable sharing with us some of the process where what you were experiencing stopped being spiritual benefit to yourself and turned into some form of exploitation or abuse?
I can do it lightly, and then you can let me know if there's more, if it would be beneficial to add more. It was like I was describing, it was rationalizing everything as being beneficial and also being told that everything was beneficial. And then the community reinforced that belief that everything the teacher tells you to do instructs you to do is beneficial. And I think for me, the first thing that became harmful was secrets. Having secrets. I was very much not a person that kept secrets under any circumstance. I'm a verbal processor. I like to talk through everything I'm thinking and feeling and experiencing, which makes this experience comfortable for me. And when that was taken away from me, because the teacher told me to keep these secrets, that became that was the landscape where I experienced harm. It was, I would like to give you special empowerments and special teachings, but this is a Vajra promise that you cannot tell anyone that you're getting these empowerments and teachings. These are private, these are for you, and you need to hold these secrets. This is part of your practice. And the secret empowerments and teachings were me being instructed in what in common language are sexual practices, but they were described to me as being purely spiritual by the teacher. And so it's both the isolation of having to keep a secret, not be able to tell any person about what you're experiencing, coupled with being instructed to do things that are very vulnerable, uncomfortable, and I mean, really, it's a fraudulent way of teaching someone if it becomes something that's not spiritual, but it's being called spiritual. And that ended up, for me, doing the most harm. The breaking of the trust, the secrecy and isolation from the community, and then being instructed to do things that really went against my body and my mind and who I was, which for me led to a lot of mental health and physical health problems, which I've come to learn is actually quite common for folks that are in that position. Yeah.
It really sounds like you're describing that by disconnecting you from anyone else but him, he was sort of narrowing the intersubjective world that those things took place in to the world you shared with him. And in that world, he held all the power.
Exactly.
How do you see the power differential playing into the situation as well?
That's a great question, because it's like, it's in a real sense a power differential, and then in kind of a made up sense for me, like the spiritual, it doesn't translate very well outside of Buddhist communities to try to describe the level of power someone like a teacher or guru has over these hypotheticals, your enlightenment, your practice, which as you become more and more practiced, that is your life, that is who you are, that is your future. So it's that type of control in every single aspect of a person. Yeah, hard to describe. I mean, you can try to describe it in the context of other religious circumstances, people that are in other religious practices that have those similarities. But at least when I am looking into examples of how this happens in a workplace, the sphere of control that a boss has in your life can sometimes feel really personal, but it's certainly your workplace, your career future, your income earning potential. And then in religious context, for me, that was really like on steroids, because it's how I view myself, how I view my very existence and my afterlife, frankly, like what happens to Rachel forever onward, not just in this moment. And that's a lot of control. That's a lot of influence. That's more than I would ever want to have. And something that I can't even quite fathom in hindsight, how someone is comfortable having that much power and control over a person, but yeah.
Yeah, so you're pointing out this way that the role of gurus or lamas in this Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhist context sort of bleeds out from just a strictly kind of spiritual into other aspects of the light of your life. And you sort of mentioned that it started becoming like including forms of physical control, like telling you how to exercise, telling you what to eat,
when to shower.
So can you talk about how that process happened to sort of colonize all parts of your being?
Yeah, I think it's this is one of the more challenging things to articulate, even maybe more challenging than articulating the literal sexual abuse, because it is this position of, I am someone who is really open to mentorship and having people let me know things that I could possibly do better to make my life better, to help me be a more beneficial, positive person in society. I still try to take feedback from people, although given the circumstances I've been in, it's harder. But I do recognize that people that are older than me, that have had more life experience and more specific life experience in one area, will have good things to tell me to do things better. And the teacher is followed by a variety of people that are at the time, I mean, I would really say this, and actually probably still true, when you see a teacher being followed by people that you identify as being really successful, wonderful, smart people, and they're taking in the guidance and the insight from the teacher without question or very minimal question, it's, for me, I was in this place of thinking, well, if all these really smart, amazing people are taking in and incorporating in the guidance of the teacher, then I don't want to miss this opportunity to get that guidance and support too, so that I can be a better person, I can have a good life experience and support people. And once you, I mean, for me, initially, the guidance and support I got from the teacher was really positive, and it was that way for a couple of years. It was around thinking better about myself, being more communicative, thinking more kindly about my body, certainly eating healthy, having exercise, a mentorship type insight into your life. And I think that because the guidance was so positive, it sort of reinforced that this is good, this is all good, these are all insightful. And when anyone gets to know you really well, they'll have more insights into how you can be a better person to yourself and to others. So I was really appreciative and grateful that I had someone in my life that was eager to better understand me, and they took on this role of how to support me in that way. I mean, it's unique. I mean, I felt really special. Like there's this person and their role is literally to know me and to help me better know myself, and in the end, be better. And then when the guidance gets that autocorrect, when the guidance starts to build and get more in a gray area, when you have years of it being positive, you sort of think, well, this one must be positive too. I have no data points that would tell me otherwise. And I see no one else contradicting or pushing back on any guidance that they're receiving. So I would be going so rogue to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure about this one. So instead it was, Rachel, just, you're wrong. You just got to believe that in this case, your gut is wrong. The teacher's got your best interest in mind. So it's complicated to describe when someone has that much control, and then it's even leaking into how you have control of the way you think. It's really, there is nowhere else to escape to where you are the one in control.
Can you tell about the process of starting to become aware that what you had been led to experience was abusive?
I can, and it's, I can try to make it succinct because it's so many years of development. And I think my understanding is it's so different for all of us. I've heard some people describe it as like, suddenly they understood something bad had happened to them. For me, it was much more a very slow, painful unraveling, because to question what had happened to me was to question my relationship with my teacher, my spirituality, my relationship with myself, my relationship with other people. All of those had to sort of be unpacked. When I first started getting guidance from the teacher that I can look back and say was unsafe, not protective, exploitive, fraudulent, my body was reacting with rashes and physical symptoms. So I would say, I mean, I don't know this, I'm not an expert on this science, but my body was the first to understand that this wasn't good for me, wasn't appropriate. And then it took a lot longer for me to understand sort of the intentionality. So it's, for me, it was, I think the reason I'm here today and how I got out of it is because for my own story, I'm a painfully explicit person. That ended up becoming really important to me getting out of my experiences, because after what happened to me happened, part of it is I'm not a good secret keeper. I have to verbally process, I have to talk it out. I was just dying for a sign that I should talk to someone about what happened. And I got a sign, not really a sign, of course, but I was looking for an opportunity to talk, where I felt like I was supposed to tell my experience. And I told my experience to someone. The reaction was very far from positive. I was more trying to grapple with what had happened to me in the context of my spirituality. But what other people heard, which took me years to fully understand, is they just heard the sexual violence. They just heard abuse. Where I was, and the reality I was in, is I was still just processing everything in the context of the religion. I went ahead and wrote an email to one of the people that I worked for, that was a board member for the Sangha I was a part of. And I just painfully articulated, very innocently, thinking I was going to get some guidance around what had happened to me, how it was spiritually beneficial, and help me better understand it, since I was struggling mentally, physically, and those mental, physical symptoms were building, and it was impacting my practice. And then instead, I got walled off from the community. So my attempt at just getting clarity was really, I'm now understanding, I was just painfully too explicit about things that are legally, factually abusive, which I didn't realize. And nobody told me. So I think that led to me getting walled off from the community, which led to me shifting my focus away from Buddhism and trying to make sense of moving on with my life and finding a way to live outside of the context of the religion, which had become so fundamental to who I was. So I spent years just trying to fully pivot myself so that I could feel like a whole person again. And it wasn't until years later, 8 years, 7, 8 years later, that I had to talk explicitly about what happened again with a friend, in the context of, it was the pandemic and they were talking about Buddhism, and I was told to connect with another person who was a survivor of similar abuse in Buddhism. And that was the first time someone gave me the permission to understand and realize that what had happened was not a spiritual practice, and that it is what it actually is, which is sexual violence.
So you were still looking to find a way to frame it for yourself in spiritual or Buddhist terms when you turned to the board, and they were unable to do it because they understood how far outside the boundaries it was. Is that right?
I'm making an assumption, but I mean, I write to these people that I trust and that are my mentors and my employers, the people I lean towards, for them to help me unpack it all. And I didn't get like a clear, I mean, it could have been, oh yes, here's this teaching, here's how this relates. And instead it was a very loud silence, a very loud handling of how to manage me and keep me separate and closed from the community, which was very much a surprise to me, because I was thinking there must be some answers out there. At the time, I was even Googling what was happening to me to see if I could find anything. Whoever on the back end at Google sees those search results is like, oh, this poor person. But yeah, I really thought there must be some answers out there, because I was still very much trusting of the teacher. That started to unravel in the course of, the trust of the teacher for me started to come into question. But what I first felt the harm and pain of is when I went to the group that my Sangha for support, which we all bow to each other for that support. It wasn't there. That was the first major blow to really just push me out of that orbit into just empty space where I had to find a new place to center myself.
Why do you think that happened?
For who I am now, where I am now, really far outside of the context of the religion, looking at it again for the first time, and who I am as a professional with history and public health, if anyone came to me with the story I came to the people that I trusted with, I would be my level of concern would be very high. my level of trying to document, to sort out, honestly involve law enforcement, all of those things for me, now that would be my first reaction. There would be no question that that's not a necessity.
And could you describe what it did to you as a human being, as a practitioner, and as a survivor to have that happen?
Well, as a practitioner, I didn't know how to practice Buddhism anymore, frankly. Just starting there, I really tried at first to still sit, to still have my practice, because it was at that point so critical to who I was in my daily life. But it was like a firework, or like geysers of questions and concerns that I just, in my body and in my brain, couldn't escape from. So practice became unbearable. It's really the only word I can think of. So that the possibility of practicing Dharma kind of went out the window. It just wasn't going to be able to happen for me. I tried, it couldn't work. And I didn't know any Buddhists outside of the community I was a part of, because I went in having no prior experience with Buddhism. So there wasn't really anyone else I could lean towards to recover a practice that could be one where I had clarity around what happened to me. Instead, I just really just buried it. I just decided to omit that entire part of who I was. The part of myself that got to have these flourishing, healthy, happy relationships in the Sangha I was a part of, the relationships I built, the amazingly good moments and happy moments I had there, all kind of got contained inside of who I was. As a long-term goal, I'd like to find ways to reintegrate those aspects of myself, because when those parts of myself, those memories and that history and those years of life got siloed away in myself, it took with it some of the things that I like about myself and the things that help me access joy and connection. So it's still a work in progress. Right now, they're not as accessible. They're not integrated into who I am in the way I hope they can be in the future. But I think it's a big challenge to figure out how to navigate those waters. It's quite hard. But some of the healing for me has been to connect with people that have had those same experiences. And when I say the things I'm saying out loud right now, they resonate in some way with them. And I can experience some validation, some camaraderie in the experience, which has been immeasurably helpful for me.
So you're bringing it out of the shadows that you had been told to keep it in.
And then, biologically, I think would be remarkable if a person could go through all of that and just recoup. I would love to meet and talk through that with someone who has, because it seems like for all of us, because of how deeply rooted the practice is to your life and to yourself and to your worldview and the way you think, it's almost impossible to get through that without being quite terribly scathed, like just kind of like raw of needing to just sort of rebuild. And I think that some of the rebuilding, it was quite delayed because it was such a murky place to be in. It lacked such clarity. I didn't have tools in my tool belt for navigating those things. So I'm looking back with compassion on myself. Of course I buried it. Of course I didn't give oxygen to it. I let that part of myself, just because of survival. I needed to keep living. I needed to keep having a life. I needed to have some daily existence, and it needed to happen separate from what that was in order for me to move forward. And it's still something I'm working through. It sounds so corny to say every day, but kind of, because it's me, it's Rachel, it's like my life existence is unraveling this in part, unfortunately. So that was their party favor. That was their parting gift for me, a life of unraveling. But for better or for worse, I get to be on the other side in the sense that I don't have that autocorrect feature for myself anymore. In any circumstance, I refuse to autocorrect for any reason, for better or for worse, but I think for the better. So I'm really grateful that I have that learned experience.
It really sounds like a process of learning how authentically and without any dogma to go through a process of self-liberation.
I like that language a lot. I feel like it gives me more credit than I deserve, but it's really nice. Yeah.
I'm just describing what I'm seeing in your process.
Yeah, it's hard. Some of the teachings held me back in interesting ways because these concepts of like there is no I, there is no me. How do you recover when you took yourself as thinking about who you are as Rachel, your self-identity, to you've really expanded yourself to really letting go of these ideas of who you thought you were and yourself. And I really took those practices to heart because I resonated with them, honestly. So it was harder for me to figure out how do I come back to even having a place of understanding who I am as an individual person. And that was less intentional, kind of just had to happen, but that was interesting too, to go through that experience.
Would you feel comfortable describing in some general or more specific terms what that so-called spiritual teaching and empowerment process that led to abuse or was abuse looked like for you?
I can. I think it was instructions to do physical acts to the teacher and to allow physical acts to happen to my body in tandem with visualizations and meditation practices. So it was this surrendering of a connection with my physical body as part of that process. I couldn't be physically in those moments. And I don't know if there was intention behind knowing that by putting me into these visualizations and meditations. But it was me escaping my body to be in these visualizations and meditations, to be in practice, so that things that were sexually exploitive could happen to my body. And then also me being told to visualize and meditate in certain ways and perform physical acts on the teacher's body. It is interesting that one of the things that was asked that I do as part of the practice to the teacher's body, that was part of the spiritual practice, was the request to suck his tongue, which, just as a side note, that took me a very long time to be able to say out loud, because it is something that as soon as it was asked of me, it didn't land in my body very well. The autocorrect went into overdrive. Like, I need to just accept that this is a request that my teacher is asking me to do as part of this visualization, as part of a visualization. Yeah, and it wasn't until very recently that I became aware of that language being used in another circumstance. It was just kind of interesting because I only had my own data point. It was only my lived experience that I'd heard that language at all. And then as soon as it hit the news that had happened, that request had happened in another Buddhist context, I heard about it because people were reaching out to me to say, I've only ever heard that language from you. So temporarily, it put a little bit of a spotlight on that aspect of what happened to me, which was just really unexpected. Unfortunately, in those moments, I just really wasn't present. It's hard to really quite describe, but it was non-conversational. I guess is not to laugh, but it was just, I'm thinking about how frozen I was and how there was just no pushback, but I didn't understand. I'll say that I didn't understand the request or the instruction, but that the follow-up statement was just after he said to suck my tongue, he said to suck it like a lollipop. So it was much more like instructional than it was conversational. Outside of the actual moment of what happened, that my teacher did describe that I am an open vessel and he is pouring into me all of his blessings, and that everything I receive from him is me opening my mouth to receive all of the blessings. Like the visual of like liquid is more just like anything and everything that he did, I was to just be a recipient of. But there wasn't conversation around like specifically around bodily fluids, just that in general, everything that was a byproduct of the teacher, directly or indirectly, just I need to be mindful of being a recipient of it. The preciousness of the teacher has no bounds in my mind of the way I thought at the time. Yeah. And that happened over the course of several months, completely in secret, under the cloak of Vajra promise, you know, so the consequences of talking about it were the hellfire and brimstone thing. And so I went through receiving and doing those behaviors as a practice for several months before there was an incident where I was instructed to drink a large volume of alcohol. And I blacked out actually from the alcohol. And then an act was performed on my body while I was unconscious. It was that moment that I had the challenge. That's where my thinking, my autocorrect kind of started to get stuck, because everything up to that point, I could autocorrect as practice because it was framed as practice. It was it was performed as practice. I could autocorrect the heck out of those, even though I was getting ill and I was struggling. I was articulating to my teacher that I was having these challenges, which he let me know, you know, around the circumstances of me being a Christian, etc. So I was really working so hard to be a recipient and be grateful for the teachings that were becoming increasingly more challenging for me. But the last thing about being unconscious, for my autocorrect didn't have that capacity. It was outside of its scope of autocorrection. It was like, wait a minute, I didn't do visualization. I wasn't even in my body. I was completely unconscious. I don't, you know, very limited memory of what happened. How was that practice? Really got stuck on that, and I couldn't get unstuck on it. It started to be this reoccurring pop-up thought, like the pop-up weasel in my brain. And I kept trying to re-push it down, until I finally popped, in the sense of I told someone what happened, and the response was not positive. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't context, like what you were saying, like the possibility to say, this is actually how this is a teaching, and this is how this falls within the scope of the religion. It was essentially like very much a shunning. I was being handled and migrated away from the community, which was not at all what I expected to have happen. Of course, as someone who really felt like what was happening to me, I really believed it was religion. It was within our practice. So it's quite a shock. I was very earnest about wanting to have clarity, and it wasn't support or clarity. Neither was provided. It was a missed opportunity on their part, I will say, from the perspective of self-preservation. Had I been told, like someone had sat down with me and said, let us help you understand this in the context of the religion, I feel very confident I would still be a Buddhist and I would still be in that community, because I was very much eager to maintain that belief structure that had become my whole life and my whole existence. And to take myself away from that was the most painful experience of my life, continues to be the most painful thing about my life. So I'm grateful that they didn't in the end, of course, but they did have that opportunity.
I know there are other communities that have sought to find ways to justify and contextualize even the most extreme sorts of harm and sexual violence. I'm also very grateful that the people who handled you didn't have access or didn't improvise any of those contextualizations. Can you share something about your efforts to have some sort of accountability for what happened?
Yes, that came more recently. In my experience, it was, I had these things happen to me. I attempted resolution for myself and with my community. That was not received or reciprocated. And then I went into survival, a place of survival. I just need to move on with my life. I stayed in that space for a really long time. And the things for me that became clear much later put me in a position where I would have to autocorrect myself out of accountability at this point. If I wasn't, once you realize what's happened to you is a crime, fraudulent, it's bad, we can all be in agreement. We're all on the same page here. Having, as a teacher, when you have, there's definitely different problems around the sexual abuse elements that I experienced, the fraud of calling sexual behaviors a teaching and a practice. And then, without disagreement, having intercourse with an unconscious body. We can all say these things are not good. So we're all I'm on that other side now. I'm understanding. Once I realized that was the case, and I finally looked at my story and what had happened in my life from that perspective of, I have no religion in my mind. I have no autocorrects in my mind. I'm re-examining what happened to me and understanding it, reading it face value. What did I say at the time? How do I remember it? There's no doubt that what happened was bad and criminal. Then it was, well, then I have to do something about that. If I would have to convince myself otherwise. It was really just more like, what happens next is what happens next. If I had been there when if I were the person hearing what I had to say at the time, what guidance would I tell myself? Where would I support myself? And it would have been to call law enforcement and to make a police report, which is what I did. So I made a police report. I outlined what happened. I provided the letters I wrote years ago at the time. I provided medical records. I provided everything just to say, this is what happened. It is a crime. And the right thing to do for me was to make a police report. I did that, and I lived in this space of thinking that maybe there was this possibility that no one thought that what happened to me wasn't a teaching. Like, everyone was on the same page thinking it was a teaching. I started to understand that there is responsibility as a group, as a Sangha, as a board of a nonprofit, that it was made aware of what happened, didn't respond to what happened, and then to understand that there's a possibility that this pattern has been facilitated over time, that the accountability is not isolated to the predator who predates, but also the person, the people that facilitate that predator to have access to the people that they then choose to harm. So the accountability falls beyond just the one single person. And what that accountability looks like, it really seems to vary. Where I was in my mind with it in the beginning was, I really wanted what had happened to me to be part of the public domain. I wanted people that were going to engage in the community that I was a part of to have this as like a data point so that they could sort of discern for themselves, like, how do I want to move forward with engaging in Buddhism in this particular community? That was my first goal. I didn't think of it as accountability. I thought of it as like, this is just the right thing to do. Like, everybody, like, if I shouldn't keep this as a secret anymore, other people should know, because it's not good. And in my view, it's criminal and bad and dangerous. And so I should make sure that other people are not put in the same situation I was in to the best that I can. And then to think about from the perspective of the predator, I personally am on the side of now thinking there's absolutely no way that an adult man can do these things to a young woman and think that they themselves are just acting out their enlightenment. I don't think they think, I would be shocked if that's the way someone thinks about it. I think that There's much more at play there. So I think if someone is deciding for themselves they're going to do the things that happened to me, then I think that they deserve criminal consequences. So speaking of accountability, I mean, as a society, we have it set up that if you do choose to do things like have sex with an unconscious body or facilitate fraudulent sexual activities under the guise of, religion, we have consequences in society that protect you from doing that to more people. And that, to me, I guess, is the ultimate accountability. Just reducing the likelihood that someone can continue to do harm just seems like such a important part for me of my healing process, and then of just understanding that that is the way society is meant and it's set up like that. So I can just go ahead and engage in those processes so that that can happen, hopefully happen.
What responsibilities do you think members of Buddhist communities who have teachers within those communities that have outstanding allegations against them are?
Oh, that's a great question. One thing that's been really interesting for me is I went into, it's not a secret, I have decided to I pursued criminal allegations with the teacher, and I pursued civil allegations against the board, the people that I had trusted and that, in my view, facilitated these experiences I had. I think at first, for a very long time, actually, I thought that it was really just like I was hoping, my ultimate hope for everyone that was in the community was that they could get to a place of just being able to admit that the teacher can do something not good, unhealthy, unsafe, not protective. I mean, that was like, if people could just wrap their minds around that's a possibility, then we can make sure that this community and other communities can be safer and healthier and less likely to not be protective of people that are vulnerable or people in general. And then I became more aware of the way, at least the community that I was a part of, thinks about what happened, and hearing everything that I had happened to me, I know of no other people besides the former community I was a part of that seemingly thinks of it as being just a completely normal part of the practice. It's just still like, that is what the practice is. It really made me start to question much more my position as an apologist, and much more my position of, I don't know if enough prevention is happening here. I don't know if enough honesty is happening. I don't know if enough just human decency is happening. And so that kind of unraveled for me a whole different way of thinking around, what do we normalize for ourselves as individuals, but then in groups? I think my assumption is that if you were to ask Buddhist members of these communities anonymously questions about their perceptions of what's okay, spiritually okay and acceptable, and what isn't, on paper, I think logically people would think, oh, certainly these things kind of fall outside the scope of what I perceive as my religion, as what I perceive as part of our practice. But then it seems that I don't know how well those translate into behaviors when it comes to responding to people that bring up those things after they've happened to them. That disconnect to me has become really fascinating, and a point of like, I'm just very interested in the ways that after you're presented with circumstances that are not in alignment with what you would probably think of as good, safe, and healthy for other people, it becomes something that you immediately work towards rationalizing within the context of the religion. Where is your mind and your thinking going between those two things is really interesting to me.
What do you think Buddhist communities need to be doing to make their spaces safer for people?
I don't know which ones can't. Like, there's no way I could know that for me. But if the premise of creating a safety net as a community can't exist, because all power and influence is still within one person, the giver or teacher. It's really hard to know how you could actually create a safety net, because one person can't create a safety net for themselves. If society decided Rachel can do or say anything, and we're not going to give her any accountability, then there's no safety net around my behaviors. I mean, that would be horrifying. I mean, if no one could question, I would think that I could certainly overburden a work colleague. I could certainly overburden my spouse. I mean, there's so many things that I could do intentionally and unintentionally that could cause harm if the safety net was predicated on what did Rachel say is okay? What did Rachel give her sign off to? I don't know if that dynamic is able to coexist with a social safety net of these are our community norms and practices around what we've decided is safe and healthy. A country by country, like the United States, our laws and norms tell us in part what that safety net is. So if something's happening here, it does sort of it by default lives within that safety net. If a crime has happened, a crime has happened. That's part of our safety net as a country. And each country has their own defined safety nets around what those are. And then at the community level, how do you do more to protect people with that safety net? I think it's a lot to unpack. So if you're in that situation where the teacher is still so unquestionable, there is no way to pivot or have conversation or facilitate ways of building that safety net, it's hard for me to know what your next steps would be as a community. It's really hard to say. But if it's a community that does seem to have that ability to create a safety net and be more protective, I think it would be really important to have a sense of what are our boundaries for what's okay and not okay. Like let's make sure we are clear on those. Like asking each other, if we had a 19-year-old Sangha member and the teacher asked her in private to give a back massage away from everyone and then asked her to not tell anyone, as a community, do we believe that's part of what's okay for our practice? Really ironing those out for yourselves, like what are our boundaries? Seems to me to be a good first step. And to find consensus around what those are is a good next step. Those seem helpful. Those seem like they would be helpful from my perspective.
It seems like you've identified a lot of conditions that are basically normative in most Tibetan Buddhist communities that make that complicated, like the intensity of the power that's concentrated just in terms of the institutional structures where everyone on a board or in positions of responsibility has their primary loyalty be to the teacher. Then the ideas of the infallibility of the teacher, or just the concept that the teacher is representing the Buddha or is the Buddha, then all the work that we do on ourselves that you describe so eloquently of auto-correcting or self-editing, and then the idea of Vajra promise or sacred bond or Samaya, I think that's the concept that you're talking about, how that sort of creates this space where things really can't be questioned. So we've been kind of focusing a little bit on more the community and structural level. Maybe just like it would be good to conclude by thinking more specifically about the personal level of survivors. And among the audience that will hear this, there will be some people who have been harmed by Buddhist teachers, but there will be a lot more who have experienced forms of sexual violence or abuse at the hands of non-Buddhist teachers, maybe non-clergy. What can you say to them about the process of healing?
Something I do have to remind myself of is that nothing that happened to me is my fault. It's not my fault. I'm not the one at fault. Something I've noticed happens, not just in Buddhist communities, of course, but in any of these situations, is the people that harm you are very quick to try and find ways to make you feel bad about what they did to you. And I listen to that Taylor Swift song Karma quite a bit It's quite funny. One of her statements is, I keep my side of the street clean. And I just like to remind myself and remind other people, their side of the street is littered with people they've raped and harmed. Your side is not. You have not done that. They've done that. You have not done that. So as much as they try and shift the filth that's on their side of the street onto you, it doesn't belong on your side of the street. It's not a part of your side of the street. It's just 100% their side of the street. They can have that madness and that unhealthiness. Being in these systems and being a victim of some of these things that happen, it's just not the fault of the victim. It just isn't. As much as I've definitely been the recipient of people trying to make me feel that it is my fault, it just absolutely is not my fault. And anyone outside of the people that are trying to make you feel that way would agree that it's not your fault. So that's something that I have just had to hold on. Speaking of like clinging, ego, that's something that it's not so much a claim, but it's just a very precious truth for me that I just keep really close and I let it be undeniable. It is not uncommon for people that are backed into corners or people that have done bad things to try and get out of it and to try to make you feel like they didn't do anything. That whether it's like the 3-year-old who ate the cookie before dinner, like whoever it is, people like, no, I didn't do that. Or, unless innocently, no, gaslighting you, it's you. Just water off a duck's back. It hurts, it's painful, it's not easy, but it's not about you. Yeah, it's about them. Spend a lot of time thinking about that.
And I think maybe one more question about what would have been helpful and what might be helpful for other people who are being told about someone else's experience of abuse.
Oh, it's very hard. I hear other people's stories as someone who has had those similar stories. So the way it lands with me is very much, I'm in a place of wanting to be, just to validate the person and make sure that the person feels understood and what they're saying is it's okay for them to say it. There's permission to say it, and what they're saying can be validated. Like they deserve to feel safe to say what they have to say. If I hadn't experienced anything and was hearing stories, I imagine it would be very challenging, and that people that are experiencing stories that don't have a place in themselves to resonate with those stories, there might be different types of unpacking that has to happen that would be good for them to pursue. In general, I'm really sympathetic that when I tell my story to people, I'm just telling people what happened in my life. And so for me, I'm just talking about my life and myself. But for other people, that's not part of who they are in their life. It hits and lands differently than it does for those of us that have had those lived experiences or living those experiences. So maybe we just all can give ourselves more grace and kindness. This is hard. It's completely not easy. And but we all get the opportunity to be there for each other. And it just has been immeasurably important in my recovery that people are there for me and I get to be there for other people. And that is a strength that we get to have, that community. I guess in the end, I'm thinking more about, I am where I am after these last few years have been really, I've been focused on unpacking these circumstances for me. And I've been really fortunate to have circumstances that are supportive of me doing this unpacking. And I just want to highlight that there are resources and support and community that are available for people that are feeling that they're in a place to do some of this unpacking, unraveling, whatever word resonates most for you, that there is that space and there are these resources for people. And there are many allies and people like you, Damsha, that are there to provide some anchor points in this journey of working through these things that happen to us in the context of guru teacher abuse. but then also to say, it's a transition. It's okay if it's not time for you to do that unpacking, unraveling, that work. There's no, like, there isn't a time limit. It's when and as it works and is comfortable for a person to do it. It's not prescriptive of, there is no, like, it needs to be done now, or there's no urgency. It's really just completely 100% that, speaking of like control, that you have your own control and power over how this happens for you and when, and but that everyone else is, there's just many people that are cheering you on, and and there's just a lot of support and love and kindness that exists for people that are going through this unpacking.
So I just want to thank you for all of the wisdom and strength that you showed and that you shared with people here.
Thank you. Thanks for having the conversation with me.